Hello everyone and welcome to my guide on hand reading. Now this is the very first video I've ever done for YouTube, so forgive me for the crappy sound quality, video editing and my awkwardness on camera. But I guess y'all came here for the information contained in this guide anyway, so enjoy. I want to start this guide off by mentioning that this is going to be a very advanced guide, mainly aimed at competitive players who already understand all the basics of the game and try to push their game to the next level. If you are a beginner or an intermediate player, there are definitely more important things for you to learn about, which will have more impact on improving your gameplay than this topic. One example would be Kuma's very thorough beginner's guide, who covers a vast variety of topics to get started. And another source for great information and guides would be Swim's channel. He made a lot of guides, everything from beginner to advanced level. So I will link these two sources below the video. But now without further ado, let's get into hand reading. So we will start off on a very basic level here and increase in complexity throughout the guide. Let's begin with a definition of hand reading. So my personal definition is correctly estimating the probability of a card in an opponent's hand to be a certain card. Now it's very important to note that we're always talking about probabilities here. We can never be 100% sure which card exactly is an opponent's hand until he plays it. And to make this a little bit clearer, I will apply one of the most important concepts from poker here, which is the concept of putting your opponents on hand ranges rather than single specific cards. Let me explain what exactly I mean by that in an example. So for the sake of simplicity, we will just assume that our opponent does not mulligan and that we are in the tournament and know our opponent's deck list. So we queued up into a Bannerman mirror here. So if I want to know the likelihood of my opponent playing a Fleet Feather Tracker on turn 1, it's pretty simple, right? I know he runs 3 copies, so the chance for each and every single one of these cards to be Fleet Feather Tracker is 3 out of 40 or 7.5%. So in total, times 5, this means 37.5% chance of opponent playing Fleet Feather Tracker on turn 1 if he didn't mulligan. Now the first thing that our opponent played in this match is a Remembrance on turn 3. So as soon as this card leaves his hand, and we can see what it is not a hand range anymore but a specific card. And that changes the hand ranges of all the other cards in hand slightly. So he runs 2 Remembrances. What happens now is that each and every single one of these cards is only 1 out of 39 to be a Remembrance. And the probability for his cards being other cards goes up very slightly. So for example, this card now has a 3 out of 39 chance of being a Bannerman instead of a 3 out of 40 chance. So all of this is pretty obvious. This can be done by a deck tracker. You don't even need to waste your time and energy on that. But I do want to emphasize that this is the only purely objective information we can get on opponents' holdings. Everything from now on is subjective interpretation and only probabilities. And the better you are at estimating those probabilities correctly, the better you become at hand reading. And the tool we're going to be using is called narrowing down our opponent's hand ranges. Any new card our opponent draws from his deck is going to have a maximally wide range, meaning it could be any copy of the cards left in his deck. The longer our opponent holds cards in hand, we can narrow down his range by assuming that he would have played certain cards in certain situations. So if we have a look at this deck list here, we can assume that he did not hold a Fleet Feather Tracker on turn 1 and no War Chest on turn 2, possibly also no Bright Steel Protector. And we can cut all of these cards out of the ranges for the cards that our opponent is holding on turn 1 and 2. Obviously we don't need to keep track of every single range of each of opponent's card at every moment, but we want to focus on the most important cards for a specific matchup. Let me illustrate this in another example. Alright, now let me show you how to use this skill in a situation that actually matters. We don't need to perfectly assess the range of every card in opponent's hand, and we don't need to keep track of every single card that is in opponent's deck. But we want to focus on the cards that are most important and most impactful for this matchup. This situation here is very classic for a War Mothers versus Kinku Elusive matchup. The Elusive player has built a formidable advantage on board and is kind of threatening lethal on his next attack, and we have multiple options how we can deal with this. So we could try avalanching and grasping and working on his boards. But for the sake of this example, let's assume we're very sure our opponent is holding 1 or 2 Elixir of Irons in hand. So let's say if we do decide to use avalanche and grasp, we estimate our probability of winning at being about 50%. The cleanest way to deal with this board would be to cast Ruination here, but we do know our opponent is running 2 copies of Deny. If we cast Ruination, we win if it gets through at like 80% and we lose if it gets denied at like 90% probability. So if we want to determine whether it is a better play to cast Ruination here, we need to find out the probability of our opponent holding Deny in hand. And we can do that by using a tool like the Hypergeometric Calculator on Swim's website. So this tells us the probability of finding a copy of a certain card in deck depending on how many cards he's drawn already. So let's assume in our example our opponent did hard mulligan for Deny. Anything that was not a Deny was kicked from his hand. That would mean in total he has drawn 4 cards before mulligan, 4 cards after mulligan, and 1 card on each following turn. So we are on turn 6, that means 4 plus 4 plus 6, 14 cards drawn in total. And he does want one of the 2 copies of Deny in his deck. This gives us this number. The likelihood of opponent holding Deny is higher than 50%. So we would be better off using Avalanche and Grasp, but we are not using all of the information available to us yet. Because if we did keep track of the position of the cards in his hand and did see that he already played all of his cards from the mulligan, his chance of having drawn Deny by turn 6 are reduced drastically. Let's get back to the calculator to show you guys what I mean. So we changed the number of cards drawn to 6 to represent that none of the cards in his mulligan was Deny, so he can only have drawn Deny off the top of his deck, somewhere in between turn 1 and turn 6. Now if we press calculate, we get a completely different result. If our opponent is only 28% likely to hold Deny in hand, the Ruination is definitely the better play in this spot. So guys, this example is supposed to teach you 2 things. One is knowing the impactful cards for this matchup and keeping track of them. And the second one is keeping track of whether your opponent already played all of the cards from his mulligan, from his opening hand that is. Now I would only recommend doing this in matchups where certain cards are super important, because it does take quite some attention and energy to stare at your opponent's hand the whole time, to not miss any single card that is being played from a certain position in hand. I do hope that the Runeterra deck tracker will have a card position tracker added to it, just as in the Hearthstone deck tracker. To those of you unfamiliar with it, if you look at the cards in opponent's hand, every card has a little number besides them, which represents the turn it was drawn on. And the little n next to the zeros means that the card was mulliganed away. And here's an option of how you could do it manually, which I tried out in a few tournaments, but found out to take too much of your focus and energy away. What you do is you write down a bunch of numbers representing the positions in opponent's hand, and whenever he plays a card from certain position, you cross it out. And then you will remember which card in his hand was drawn in which turn. But I personally found it to be only worth it in matchups where some certain cards are super duper important and impactful. So this here is going to be pretty obvious. Our opponent can play some cards which make him draw either specific cards or from a very narrow range of cards. A good example would be Draven's Biggest Fan. It gives us precise information on the opponent's next draw. Some less reliable information would be Lure of the Depths, for example, or Deep Meditation, which limit the range of the drawn card to the pool of either sea monsters or spells our opponent has left in his deck. 2 other good examples would be cards that generate other cards, for example Jawl Hunters or Swiftwing Lancer. All we need to know is the pool of random sea monsters or random elite, and we will kind of know what our opponent is holding. The most important thing here is to keep track of which position the generated card is in opponent's hand, so we will know when he has played it or not, and if it's a main decked card or not. One other possibility to gain free information on opponent's draws are allegiance cards. Let's say our opponent plays a Bannerman deck with a Deny Splash. Him hitting allegiance obviously means his next draw is not going to be Deny. Him missing allegiance is usually much more reliable and valuable information, and it allows us to, from the next turn on, play comfortably around Deny. Alright, now I want to talk about what to be cautious of when applying hand reading. And the first thing that I'm going to dive into is the possibility of your opponent bluffing a certain important, impactful card. So I will give you guys an example of a top 8 tournament match which I played against BBG. Sadly, I wasn't streaming back at that time, so it is from his perspective, but nonetheless the takeaway is going to be the same. So the situation is as follows. I attack with the S, force a removal out of him, and have just enough burn in hand to finish him if he doesn't have a second single combat. What is very important to note here is that I did not properly see where he played the detain from. I thought he played it from the right of his hand, but he did play it from the very left, which is vital because he has been holding this leftmost card, which ended up being detained, since his mulligan. And the information I had on his hand so far was he had one card from Swiftwing Lancer in the middle, one card he held since mulligan, which was detain, and one card he just recently drew. And I thought the detain was the card he recently drew. So from my perspective, I thought the only card that would make sense for him to hold since mulligan would be single combat. So I kind of tricked myself by playing around it, by making that reading mistake. And I ended up not unleashing all my burn at once, but expecting him to interact, to single combat my Ezreal, and then finishing him, which he didn't do. Combat resolved. He made an incredible comeback, took the series away, which was quite heartbreaking for me, but well deserved due to his great play and my mistakes. So 2 important takeaways from here. One obviously being pay close attention to which cards your opponent plays from his hand. But the other one also being the potential of bluffing. So let's just assume BBG did indeed play the detain from the right side of his hand, and the prismatic barrier would have been the left card in his hand. That would have been an insane bluff. That obviously means he would have kept a card for a very long time, from which he already would have had situations where he would have gotten value out of the card. But him thinking that it would be more valuable to represent a single combat and me playing around it. So you need to be careful in certain matchups. Imagine this prismatic barrier was a Purify instead, which is a very dead card against Nox Ezreal. He could have easily held it since his mulligan and just not found a way to get any value out of it, but he can represent a single combat fairly well. So bottom line is, the higher the skill level of your opponent, the more you need to take into consideration that your opponent might just be bluffing an important card. So usually if you know your opponent is capable of bluffing, the probability of him to hold an impactful card should go down slightly. And depending on his tendency to bluff, like how much he likes to do it, it's gonna go down either a little bit or quite a bit. This takes me to the next topic of 2 common mistakes of how players frequently misuse hand reading to their disadvantage. The first one would be always assuming that opponent has the removal that he needs, or has the perfect cards, has the nuts in hand to counter our play. That term is coined in the poker community as monster underbet syndrome, or MUBS. They basically overread opponents' hands and keep themselves from playing the optimal play because they always fear that it is going to get countered. Now, the other extreme of this spectrum are completely reckless players who do not care about what opponent is holding in their hand. And that might be the Bannerman player who just drops a Cithria on turn 6 before attacking and just eats a ruination to his face right away. For these players, I have invented the term don't give a fuck syndrome, or DGAFS. So obviously you don't want to be neither of those, but rather find a balanced approach to hand reading. That does take quite a bit of practice to get familiar with the probabilities of your opponent holding certain cards, and how likely it is that they might bluff a certain card, hold back a certain card for later use. But I can guarantee you that the more proficient you become at using the skill correctly, at assessing probabilities correctly, the better you will become as a player and the more your win rate will go up. One other important thing here to note is that if you are very far behind in a game, you might not always have the luxury of playing around opponents' cards. So if you know you are going to lose the very next turn, you are kind of forced into playing as if you had don't give a fuck syndrome and go for the lethal right there. Whereas if you are very far ahead in a game, you might want to play as if you had monster under a bed syndrome. So playing around super impactful cards that might swing the game around very cautiously, even though it might not be that likely that opponents actually holding them, and instead grind out the victory slowly without ever giving the opponent a chance to catch up. So the last thing that is important to mention is, so far we have always assumed we are playing in a tournament format with open deck lists, but most of the games you will play in your life are going to be ladder games where you do not have perfect disclosure of which cards exactly are in opponent's deck. So how do we adapt to that? So let's say we queue up on ladder against an Elise Callista deck with the region combo Freljord and Shadow Isles. Now in theory we would have to extend our opponent's ranges to include all of the 126 cards from that region, minus the champions. But if you are queuing up in, say, Diamond or Masters, people are usually going to play certain archetypes, which would be the best and strongest archetypes of that hero combination. So Elise Callista with a Freljord splash looks a lot like an Endure Tokens deck. So we can go ahead and open up a sample deck list of that archetype, which might currently be running around the ladder quite a bit. For that I would recommend some meta tier lists, like for example the one on Swim's website, maybe the deck library of decks of Runeterra or the Mobilytics client. And that gives us a solid idea of what our opponent's deck might look like. Now obviously he can differ in his tech choices, and we cannot surely know which cards he put into his deck, but it is for example safe to assume that They Who Endure is such an important card in this deck that he is going to run it as a 3 of more than 99% of the time. Whereas other meme cards, like for example Sinister Poro, he's gotta play just about never. So we give that a chance of like 0.01% of being an opponent's deck. So how does that affect the hand ranges of our opponent? They Who Endure is just about gonna be a 3 out of 40 chance of being an opponent's hand, whereas cards like Sinister Poro are gonna be 3 out of 40 times 0.01%, which is virtually nothing and we don't have to bother to play around it. So what about impactful removal cards of which we don't know how many copies exactly our opponent might play? Some examples here would be Grasp of the Undying, Withering Wail, Vengeance, maybe even Ruination. We need to think about which cards make sense for opponent to tag in and which don't. In most metas, I'd say, for example, Ruination doesn't make too much sense because it is a very board-centric deck and he doesn't want to brick himself by clearing his own board. So we might give it like a 10% chance, which changes the calculation to 3 out of 40 times 0.1 or times 10%. Which effectively is a 3 out of 400 chance of him holding Ruination. Now for third copies of Vengeance, for example, or Wail or Grasp, it might be a lot more likely that our opponent plays them. So there we might just about halve the probability of our opponent having that in deck and play around it accordingly. So I'm just sharing this with you guys to show that it is kind of impossible to estimate all probabilities perfectly accurate. And no matter how good you are at hand reading, sometimes you will just get hit with ridiculous tech choices which will blow you out of the game. But that does not have to mean that it would have been correct to play around them. After all, this is a card game, you cannot win every game, sometimes opponent just has it and then it is your time to die. And then it's best to just have a little chuckle about it and move on to the next game. And now I will finish this video off by summarizing the most important takeaways from this video. Number 1, always work on narrowing down your opponent's hand ranges. Number 2 is knowing the impactful cards of every matchup, the ones you should keep an eye on and should play around. Number 3 is keeping track of the position of cards in opponent's hand and also noticing whether he still holds cards from his opening hand or whether he has already played all of them. Number 4 is be aware of bluffing, especially once you reach higher levels of opponents. And the last one is try to not overread and not underread your opponent, but rather find a good middle ground of playing around your opponent's stuff, but also knowing when to ignore it and just go for the win. So guys, that was everything I could think of about hand reading. Let me know if you think I forgot something. And this is my very first guide, so any kind of constructive feedback is highly appreciated. If you want to influence what the next guide should be about, head over to my Twitch page. There is a voting poll underneath the stream where you can leave a vote on what you think is the best suited topic for the next guide. And if you want me to release the next guide quicker, there is usually a certain follower or subscription goal on stream. And once we reach it, I will get to work on the next guide. So yeah, thank you guys for watching this and see you next time.